Hello everyone, I'm Professor Mark Keane. This is Draw Along Sessions with Keane on Architecture. Today we're going to do a base refresher course on drawing in perspective. It might be brand new to some people, it might be a distant memory, it might be something you did yesterday, but I think we'll go through these fundamental core values of drawing in perspective to move from the 2D of a piece of paper to the image of a three-dimensional object. So what I'm going to start with is probably the most simplistic type of object out there, a platonic volume, a cube. And that way we know that all the sides are equal no matter how I rotate it. But then more importantly for us is we can see the square in space easier than the dimension of, for instance, a rectangle or other forms. So the principles we're going to talk about today are being a foundation for all other Draw Along lectures. I'm glad you decided to take this one and show up for this refresher course because it's the foundation for all the other subjects we'll do for Viking.TV in terms of the history of Western canon architecture. Hundreds and hundreds of different types of architecture buildings we'll do, from model forms into the three-dimensional projection on a piece of paper. So the first thing we're going to start about, just like the title was in the prior 7-minute intro, is to talk about the three principles of drawing. And so the three we'll simply write over here very quickly as a refresher. We have to start with the horizon line, which is key to set up our relationship to the object that we're trying to draw. Secondly, then, the vanishing points, which is the science of moving from 3 dimensions to 2. It's almost sort of an illusion, kind of a little bit of trickery that the Renaissance rediscovered from the classics who invented the idea thousands of years ago, and then rediscovered in the 1450s in Italy. And then how we actually see the idea of the things in space, we have to add value to the imagery. Otherwise, it simply is just lines in space. So our subject will be the cube, again, a very simple, dominant form of architectural language because it's got that foundation of vertical lines rising off the ground, creating a volume or a space for purpose and function. So the relationship to the cube, we're going to expand instead of being a handheld object and do something small. We're going to project a larger scale on this as if we're walking up to it like it's a 2-story building. So if we're walking up in a large open space, a large field, edge of a prairie, walking towards a lake, for instance, there's a relationship between that long horizontal vista, the horizon line, and our eye height. Our eyes are all tied to that eventual distant point where the head on its torso, which is legs, are always connected to that horizon line in terms of that place. It's not where you look. Sometimes the mistake is made if I'm looking up, the horizon line is now where I'm looking. Physically, it was your eyes are relative to that line, and they're always connected. So to make a case in point here, let's have this person we did who's given a scale of 5.5 feet to 6.5 feet. The human scale is a way to determine size and proportion. Let's make them much smaller and have them walk towards the horizon line. Because they're further away, their head gets smaller, but proportionally, the torso gets smaller as well, then the legs get smaller. So within 8 seconds there, I've created distance on a piece of paper. This paper has no distance inherently in it. It's a fraction of a millimeter. And yet now you've got depth between these people. Do somebody way far away, the same scale person. And you can see this idea of projected hundreds of feet between where we are looking at these 3 people and the distance. Now we'll establish how large we want to do our subject here. And it's just an abstract. But let's pretend, for instance, this is the height of a person on the first floor of a building, and the second floor is above it. So just a 2-story cube. So we're going to come up and place then half of the line above the horizon line and half below it, that corner we're looking at here. Now here's where it gets difficult because you've been trained all your life to know the definition of parallel lines. And that's these 2 lines will never meet in space. They're going to be parallel and go off in space and never meet. And that's the definition of parallel. The language of drawing in perspective breaks that scientific idea and adds a new way of scientific elemental drawing to make it seem like it's 3-dimensional on a flat plane. So that will mean the front corner here will race these 2 lines back to a point in space. So we'll put a point way over here on the right and we'll vanish the top to that, and we'll vanish the bottom to that, to the same point on that line. So now this is our right vanishing point. Now, for the sake of making one side more dominant than the other, if we did an equal distance version of both, it kind of flattens out the drama. So we're going to look at one side more than the other. So this is primary and this is secondary in terms of how we set up our view of it, which means the left point is closer. So we'll vanish back to a point here and a point there. So now we've just broken the rule of science because we said two parallel lines are going to converge to the same point, and two parallel lines will converge to this point. Now here's the beauty of working with a platonic volume like a cube. We can see squares in space. If I were to draw this as a square, you would say, no, that's a long, flat rectangle. If I were to draw that as a square, you'd say that's a tall rectangle. But if I were to draw this, that looks pretty close to being a square in space. Same is true for the left side now. We're going to move over here and try to find that key point as a reference that looks cubic to us. So now, with a matter of a minute or two, we've created a three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional plane. So that's the illusion of perspective. Brunelleschi is the man who's sort of given credit for it to articulate that. And it's an interesting story in terms of how he actually rediscovered it. He was out in a garden one day with a mirror, and the mirror was reflecting the building behind him onto a flat plane of the mirror. And he saw on that flat plane, as if this was mirrored instead of a piece of paper, he saw the parallel lines of the building vanishing to a point on the mirror. Then he traced it on a piece of paper and saw for the first time the mechanics of perspective firsthand himself, and then realized he could restructure art and make it more lifelike by using horizon line and the vanishing points. So now we've got the left point and the right point. So now you know in the rest of architectural delineation, whatever types of space you're using, if it's orthogonal, if there are parallel lines in space, any two lines that repel each other must vanish to the same point. No matter what the height, wherever they move, wherever they are in space, if it's the site they sit on, if they're, think about the actual architecture, if it's parallel, in your mind you know that, they're all going to move to one of 2 points. And that solves all your issues in terms of trying to represent that form in space. So back to our cube, we're going to elaborate on this and show some of the language of how this builds out by starting with the left vanishing point and bringing something just directly off of that into the foreground, a straight line. From the right vanishing point, go back, and now we actually sort of have a ground plane or a site that this is going to sit on, as if this is a building on a piece of property. On the far side of it, off that same left vanishing point, is the other side of the property. So now you have, in a sense, the backyard and the front yard of this two-story volume. Because that's parallel and that's parallel to these parallel lines, it's all going to vanish to one point. When you're out on the site looking, it's hard to determine, does that seem to actually go to a different point? Now you have to use the science of drawing and saying it can't go to a different point if they're parallel. So this will help you modify and get that bottom plane to fall into place. So now our next key point now, since we understand the idea that left and right vanishing points, is to add the value to it. And value is how you see, and value is why I kind of argue that the best media for these draw-along sessions, which is the most accessible to most people, is to not just get the closest pencil in your drawer in your kitchen, but to go to an art store and buy a drawing pencil. So the brand is typically generically called a color pencil, and a lot of times they'll come in a pack with a whole variety of colors to it. But in your case, you should simply buy a small pack, 5 or 6, of just black pencils to start out with. Then when you draw along with us in this lecture series, you'll get a lot of the value you need out of the architectural sketch, as well as the value in the building, and the idea will come from one unit of media, instead of trying to use multiple different types of tactics here. And the way I kind of articulate that, and I did this in the intro as well, is a bar graph that shows where you have to move in terms of how humans see space. And again, that idea is there's always a light side to an object, there's a shade side underneath that doesn't receive light, and there's the cast shadow. So right now we've got the light side that receives more light, the shade side on the left, and it's casting a shadow onto the ground. So for us, we need to have 0% for where it's very, very bright, and we're given 0%, that's typically the paper, and then we're going to move it to 100% dark. So at this end, we have to get to a point where we're really pushing down and we're as black as this gets. And a typical 2H pencil or a drafty pencil won't get that beyond a gray, so I argue for the drawing pencil to work for you. So basically, every sketch, we have to go from the paper white to the presence of the value moving to 50%, 60, 70, 80, 90, and finally black. If you encompass all those values into your sketch, it'll pull this off even further. So let's prove that here with illusion, where I think I can make some of the paper appear brighter than the rest of the paper by using our values. So let's light this up and assume that we're going to have a dominant light source. If I took one of the light sources for this video off, we have one dominant sun side over here, so we'll leave this just bright white, which makes this side, if you simply use the side of your pencil stock, a mid-size gray. And just alone with that, it seems more three-dimensional than it was just with the lines. Then it casts a shadow from the side, let's say it's 10 o'clock in the morning, and it casts it on an angle on the ground plane. And then when it stops the shadow being thrown by this side, the top of that shadow is actually a horizontal line. So it's parallel to this line. We'll go back to that same point. It'll go to the back of the building. And now this is the darkest plane which sits the cube on the ground. And now we have a reference point of light, shade, and shadow. We've accomplished value, vanishing point, and horizon line. Now you can go and find online or through books in the library entire books just on perspective, and they'll show all the in-betweens of details and modifications that are around the big three. But this is the core, will get you sketching right away. And as you follow along with me, it's like a foreign language for some. As you speak it more and more after several different attempts, you'll start to see there's a repetition in the sketch forms, and you'll build an archive in your memory to make your sketches stronger in the future. So now I'm going to use a little bit of sight conditioning around this to help build out the idea of the presence of this cube in space. So number one, I'm going to say that a lot of times the grass or the pavement or what happens in the landscape around this is darker than the actual building face itself. So we'll wrap that around the corner and have that value come right up to the edge there. So that helps set as if this looks like a vertical plane, all of a sudden this part of the drawing looks like it's a horizontal plane. That's important to sit the weight of the building down on a horizontal plane. Then we use some of Mother Nature, and we use a couple of trees, deciduous trees around the corners here. And their trunks come down. And since they're deciduous in full bloom, the darker green is actually a nice deep tone, which will come right up to the box where it's nice and bright and help enclose that white with grays around it. So now we're working sort of in this zone of the sketch, trying to build out the whiteness of that box. If I push now the last little bit of this sort of 5-minute diagram of how to do a cube in space towards the 70, 80, 90, and 100% blacks, you'll see this white becomes brighter than this white. So let's come right to this edge, because this gray we did initially, it'll appear normally gray is one tone because it all receives less light evenly. And right when it goes to the white, it appears darker than the rest of the gray. So we'll come right to this edge and make it bolder right at that point, which creates this condition of movement around that corner faster. The same is true for the depth of the trees. They'll look darker right next to that back gray. The bottom of that tree looks darkest next to the white of the building, the underside of that tree, and the base of the shadow. So now I think, just looking through the camera lens here and how it's projected for you now, that this light becomes brighter and brighter in appearance, because the human eye as a muscle loves to have that variation of looking at an object between white, gray, and black. So gray to black to lighter gray to darker to white to white. That's an interest level that moves the eye back and forth through space. And that's how you want to modulate your ability across the planar object of the paper itself. So now we can expand on this and show how the points are working, because I selected these arbitrarily as a starting point. If we completely just shift them around and say we're going to start with the exact same corner here, and now move the right point in closer and the left further away. There's the horizon line. And if we change the light source as if it's later in the afternoon, we're going to now put the shade side on this side. It's the same box, it's the same proportion, but it's been rotated. So what we're looking at here is actually, in a sense, human software. But understand these three principles, that's the coding in the software between your ears, and that's the most important software that'll ever be out there, because there's so much power in the imagination of an individual to work with this and to manifest something between their eyes, their brain, their hand, their pencil, and onto the paper in terms of creativity. So as you move the points back and forth, you're rotating the box around different sides. And it gives you control to kind of get the actual view you'd like to show. And what happens too is that if you're, for instance, on a site and you walk up to the Duomo in Italy, maybe there's only one or two places you can sit down to draw. The building will tell you where the points have to be. If you're drawing this from a basis of a sketch about something you want to design, then you decide where the points want to be for the best type of architectural prowess for your ideas there. So here again, coming off the left point is the basis of the front lawn for it. Coming off the opposite point then sets down that same plane going the other direction. So that's variation number one. There's also cases where you might literally be above the building, looking down from a higher altitude. So for instance, we'll work over here off the same horizon line. What if your viewpoint, as I look down on this cube now, allows me to see the top as well as the two sides? That means that my horizon line is above the actual object. So in this case, our original piece, our original corner here, is completely beneath the line. And pick a left vanishing point and a right vanishing point, and simply vanish in the same way we did before. And then find your box. So we see the left and right side, just like we did before. But now we do an opposite. We go from the top of the box, instead of going to the left point, we now go to the right point, and from the right corner, you go to the left point. Now we see 1, 2, 3 points in that perspective. 1, 2, 3 points in that perspective. Do the same with your value. Make sure you have a shade side, then a cast shadow, and you can sit that down on the paper too. The next variation, which is obvious, is to what if you're completely underneath the building? And that's hard to find sometime because it's hard to elevate a building and just have space underneath it, but it could be up on a hill. It could be elevated with something driving underneath it. So we can simply come over here and do the exact same language of this, but put that key corner completely above the horizon line. Choose 2 points for it. Maybe put the left point way over here. There's no limitations to where you can establish the points. Some perspectives on site will force you to do that. And now all of a sudden, here's that magical cubic volume somewhere on Earth, which is floating in space. And that's not going to happen too often with architecture, so what more unlikely happens is that you're walking up to a small hill, maybe with a castle on it. So then you cover the base, because you can't actually see the underside, and you simply complete the hill on both sides, and then give some value to the land beneath it. And now you've shown that You've drawn something where the object itself is above your own horizon line because you're beneath the construction of the building. And that gives the sense of rising up above you in terms of the volume. Use your value again to articulate that. One's got a darker side to it. And then maybe there's some kind of circuitous path that brings you down from the top. And as it comes towards us, it gets wider and wider at the same dimension width, but leaks out toward us as we make our way up to that castle part. Okay, we will have opportunities in the course of the draw along sessions to actually move inside some of the key interiors, because architecture is well known for its formal quality and exterior, but really we spend 85% of our time inside a building. So some architects have revealed through history is that the most important part of architecture are the best interiors of all time, because that's where the actual ceremonies, the living happens on the inside of the building. So that's why I brought a box that has an open access to it. So we'll see ourselves walking into a space and wanting to draw being inside the cube rather than outside of it. So an easy way to look at that very quickly is go back to the same principles here, because they stand alone whether you're inside or outside the building. And you work it from this being your key box on this distance here as you look on the inside of it. So we're going to draw the one corner here. And we're going to project now, because you're on the inside, you reverse the principles. You start on the left, come up to your point, and then complete that part of the box. Start on the left vanishing point, come to the base, and then start drawing, and then find your cube in space. Then we can have the right part of the vanishing point, maybe as far as this away, and that'll give us that point, and that point, and the base floor here. So now we've drawn the inside of that box by going from the opposite points here on the interior. And to show some value, maybe this has got less light on it. Maybe it casts a shadow onto the floor, and casts a shadow from over on this side. So that gives us the promise of moving inside the boxes too, and look at the great interiors from architectural history over time. Now there are other forms that happen within the language of architecture that aren't orthogonal. And we'll simply look at a handful of those now to show the array of ideas that, working with the cube, you can find secondary objects that don't necessarily vanish the way the orthogonal does. So we know this because if you draw in plan that square, that cubic form, and you simply say, I want to do something that's angular in space, that no longer vanishes the same points as the cube because it's a diagonal. So if you're drawing something in space and you do your vanishing points to the left and right, and quickly do a series of cubes now to give you your basis, if you went and did an interior view of this and went to the opposite points so you can show the tops and bottoms of both sides, so since it's a transparent cube now, we know that from this corner to that corner, that's how we made the diagonal. So we can simply come from this corner to that corner in perspective, and that corner to that corner in perspective. So now that wedge in space, that great diagonal, which is found in most stair systems, is now in accurate perspective. So everything outside the orthogonal, the 3D points of view, is found by going back to the cubic forms, the rectangular forms they're inscribed in. So in this case, if it was a stair, we'd come back to this left vanishing point, because every tread, the angle of the stair is on a certain projection, but the treads themselves are all horizontal lines. So we can articulate the stair by simply vanishing those all back to the left vanishing point. And so potentially that might be the wall or the entry of a building up here that the stair leads to. So angles are a way we can check that off the box by simply going back to the box that they're found in. So whether you find that language in plan or you find it in elevation. If that's the front elevation and the angle goes like that, then you'd find the midpoint and cut it down to there and then vanish back. So there's no limit to what you can find as long as you retreat back to the sort of basis of perspective, which is cubic or orthogonal. Now the same is true if you went to something that was a bit more difficult, but certainly prominent from the Renaissance on, where the language of ecclesiastical architecture changed. Instead of being linear and procession related, it became circular. But due to the forces of geometry and the language of Platonic shapes, there's a relationship between the cosmos circle and the man-made square where they're tangential in 4 points. So one inscribes in the other. You can go to the outside of the square and have the square inscribed in a circle and keep repeating geometries to find your perspective based on that square you did. So we'll use this language of what we know to find a way to do something that supports a dome on top of a cube beneath it. So we'll come to our box once again and find points for our base. And now we want to sit a cylinder first, the necking, for a dome that sits on top of it. So what we'll do is, knowing that the top of the square goes back to the same vanishing points, opposite way. So now we know that is a square in perspective that sits on top of the front square. So to make you see that better, that's the front of the outside of the building, and that's the flat top of the square on top of it. If you bisect any square in space, it'll give you the midpoint of it. So any type of square in space, bisect it, it tells you where that point is. Then you can draw these points in the perspective line to find where the circle is inscribed inside of that. So we've got the square up top, we've bisected it, and then coming off the left vanishing point and the right vanishing point, we found 1, 2, 3, and 4 points for the circle. So now we can arc that in here. So we're seeing the underside of a cylindrical volume that sits on top of this cube. So in elevation, it's a cube, and on top of that, a cylinder sits on top of that. And now we're going to simply put a hemispherical dome on top of that. So from the top of this, it's just a simple arc of a partial circle and maybe a cupola on top of that. So that's how we could inscribe something three-dimensional circular, planar circular on top of a cube. And now here's the left side that encloses that. Now this has a planar aspect in terms of value, where it simply goes from one edge to the other. Light hits cube and splays across it in a different type of form. So when it's the hot spot is not toward the edge of it like it is here, where it receives light and it goes from one to the other. It's kind of in the middle of the circle and then dissipates to the edge and dissipates to the other edge. So you have more of a three-dimensional movement across that plane. And so we'll look at a series of domes, certainly in the Renaissance period and beyond, which will articulate that movement of light across a great volume like that in space. Okay, now we come to a real fun part in terms of building onto this, and we'll keep playing with this sheet. We're going to look at the idea of simply designing ideas through perspective, as if you're a sculptor working with three-dimensional objects inside the space itself. So we're going to take the paper stock and simply flip it over. Oops. And we'll do it two different ways. We'll start one with a line in the center, and we're going to have our designed object beneath the horizontal line, which will take us from a left vanishing point and a right vanishing point down to some key corner. So that will be the basis of looking down on a composition of ideas where, for instance, boxes might be stacked. So we can then simply play with the idea of perspective by building out, kind of whimsically, the language of planes in space. And you can break these as you see fit in terms of how they move back and forth from line to line, from box to box. Just keep going left and right, build things out, and splay back and forth, create pathways, but everything's rushing back to those key points. And this is looking down from a sort of a street or city scene. As we build up, we'll break the plane and come up a bit above in the backdrop, which forces us to, again, the left point and the right, as if that's a larger tower in the back. And that may have a partner block there. And then finally, in the distance on the back of the complex, the pinnacle piece of the composition. All at the 2 points, the city kind of builds out. Potentially on this side, then we've got the cavity of a street rushing by. The same on this side, it might be broader. It's a minor street, a major street. And then we see maybe the smaller structures on this side coming back in perspective to rise right to this corner. The edge of these buildings coming to the corner, and the complex we've designed in the front here. That's again our horizon line in terms of how we set that up. It's the vanishing points, left, right, and now our value. Take every form you want. The left side of every aspect will simply wash with a value. And that'll clarify how it's holding space on this corner. So that's our first layer of moving from the 0 to 50%. And now we want to keep moving to 100% dark at some points. Now, one of the key things we're going to look for as we finish this sort of diagrammatic sketch of just sort of building out an urbanistic sort of volume city here is the idea in terms of making a volume seem more poignant on a flat canvas like that. There are 2 distinct types of lines. One of the lines is when you look at a volume, and this vertical line has got a presence to show the shape and the turn back to the vanishing points, but it's not holding volume directly behind it. You can't pass the pencil behind it and hide it. So it's less important in terms of value than this line is, because this line is actually holding space and volume and pulling off the page. This is showing the front of 2 planes coming together. This is showing a division between the object and a void behind it. So now the pencil goes beyond it. This makes this a much more dominant line. So in sketching, to make these things come off the page more, this is less important, this is more important. So we're going to come initially just on these edges and push towards 70 or 80% of value all the way around the subject as you kind of seem fit here wherever you're creating space. Then when it touches another building, it now is just a plane meeting a plane, so now it's less important here than it was up there. So we're going to wrap around, bring that down to this edge. This one's very important here, coming back for our neighbor across the street. This one holds space on the corner. Drops down, then it stops because it marries another twin plane there. That one's more important. Back to there. This is important coming down. This. And that's important. And now we'll have the idea of this weight of all this mass, this urban mass down here, will change in value at the base, so it holds by having a darker tone city grid or foundation for it. So between the neighboring buildings across the street and going down toward the horizon, we'll simply wash that with a tone too. That's why it's important to have a series of these ready to go, because it's a softer lead-based object, so you'll go through it quicker than a traditional pencil, but that's the price you pay for getting to black as well. So this will rush down to our base, and now it has a place to sit on there. And then maybe articulate the sidewalk area on both to set it away. And to give scale, because right now we've never designed anything that's really articulate like a brick or a doorway or a human being yet. As soon as you put something that people associate the scale with, it'll tell people the size of this. So for instance, if I said this was a person on the horizon line and the head was this big, all of a sudden this looks like maybe a jungle gym for kids in the backyard, a playground. But if I said the person is actually this height on top of a terrace area next to these apartments or office buildings, now we know the scale of the whole complex. And so we can put in a series of people at that scale around the base of the building to give some sense of the size of the sketch we just did together here. So it allows for the idea of building different shapes of cubes and any type of angle to actually do the object you're trying to articulate. So if you're on site doing the Duomo, for instance, but it also liberates you to simply dream and sketch and build out your own ideas in 3D by having the ability to move through, again, our key aspects of use your horizon line, find your two vanishing points, and then make sure you articulate value. So that's our premise, our primer for the rest of the draw along sessions, which will be more content laden with history at hand. Thanks for joining me, and pen before mouse, keep drawing. Thank you.